Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight on this very cold but not snowy day. We have a very special presentation for you tonight. We have Irene Miller, author, Holocaust survivor, speaker, blind person. The light is bright. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Irene.
No, I don't need a thank you. I'm hooked up. Good evening. I come to you as one of the very small group of children, Jewish children who survived. Only 10% of Jewish children survived the Holocaust. Among the 6 million of Jews who were killed were 1.5 million of children, 90% of Jewish children. Of course, I can tell you only about my survival journey, but those of us fortunate to be left alive become also the voices of the children who did not live to tell their story. I was born in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. This is what I looked like when the Nazis attacked Poland. I was 5 years old. My immediate family was made up of 4. Here is my older sister and I. She is here 8, and I am 3, and our parents. But we had a large extended family in Poland, numbering of about 100 members. When the Nazis attacked Poland, it seems to me that Warsaw was under siege for a few weeks. Day and night, bombs were falling. We lived on the top floor of an apartment building, where it was the most vulnerable place because bombs were falling through the roof ceilings and into the homes. So with the cooperation of friends who lived on the second floor, we moved in with them. But even there it wasn't safe from the bombs. One night, a bomb fell into that apartment, exploded by the door, leaving the only way out was through the window, and that was the second floor. My father, who was a very tall man, knocked out the window and jumped, and he said, we have to quickly follow him before the whole place gets engulfed in flames. When my turn came, I stood on the windowsill and looked down. It seemed so far down. I was so scared I couldn't move. My mother pushed me out the window. Somehow, my father did not catch me, and I fell on a pile of glass, cutting my arms and legs. When the family was down, my mother picked me up, carried me to a bomb shelter, and there she was sitting and pulling out shards of glass out of my limbs. These running to bomb shelters occurred over and over, particularly at night. At some point, we lost the water. A bomb severed the water pipes, and the only way we could obtain at least drinking water is running down the street when there was still a functioning faucet. I remember exactly where I was when Nazis entered Warsaw. I was in our own apartment. I don't remember it was the 4th or the 5th floors, but I was too high up to see the Nazi soldiers filling the width of the street. I couldn't see their faces, but strangely, I could see the reflection of shining boots pounding and pounding the pavement. You know how many years have passed since the war ended? And for the little people here, the war ended not just before your parents were born, but probably before your grandparents were born. Yet, there are still some sounds, some smells, some aromas to which I still react emotionally. One such sound are low-flying planes. Another one is a rhythmic pounding on a hard surface. I hear it and I tighten up, though I don't know exactly what I connect it with. My parents felt that being Jewish, my father was also the leader of the labor union in the Jewish division, so as such they were liberal people, and they felt that they would be among the first ones to be persecuted by the Nazis. So sometimes during the winter of 1939 and 1940, they sold the lease to our apartment, hired a Polish guide to smuggle us across the border into the Soviet Union. On one side, Poland borders with the Soviet Union. Why to go there? Because at that time the Nazis were not there yet. As you know, later during the war they attacked the Soviet Union as well. And why to smuggle us? Because the borders were closed and they would not allow anyone to enter. I remember the last leg of that journey trying to cross the border. It was in the middle of the night, extremely cold. We were wearing layers and layers of clothing to keep warm and also to minimize under luggage. We were sitting inside a wagon of hay, the hay over our faces, over our heads, and over all that an old blanket. So should a Nazi soldier come across that wagon, he would not be able to see the people in it. At some point, this man stopped, let us off in an area that was surrounded by tall trees. You couldn't see what's beyond that. And he said that we had crossed the border and pointed where in the morning we were to take the train towards the city where my parents were headed, called Bialystok. We huddled up for the remainder of the night. And when we woke up in the morning and tried to leave the area, we saw beyond it a field with thousands of people laying on the snow, leaning against bags, suitcases. This man did not take us across the border. He left us on the no man's land. My parents did not want to go back to Poland from where they were trying to escape. My mother pulled out a blanket, spread it over the snow among people. People were sitting very close, one next to the other. She also pulled out a down comforter, commonly used in winter in Europe. And this place, in an open field in winter, became my home for about 6 weeks. My mother would repeat over and over, move, move. If you move, you are not going to be that cold. I moved as much as I could, and when I couldn't anymore, I would crawl under the covers. At some point, my feet got frostbitten. I had open wounds, wasn't able to wear my shoes. So my mother tore a garment of hers, wrapped my feet in rags, and I shuffled around as well as I could. At some point, we decided that something needs to be done. That I said we, our parents, because they felt that there was did not seem to be an end to it. But before, let me tell you how we survived that period. The only food we were able to buy is that which the peasant women from nearby villages would come after sundown, bring bread, sometimes boiled potatoes, sell them for exorbitant prices. The only fluid we had for drinking is melting snow. I remember many scenes from the no man's land, but two in particular are very vivid in my mind. I woke up one day, and that is one night, and there was a strange man next to me under the covers. I tried to push him out, but apparently I fell asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, the man next to me was dead. People were dying from diseases, from exposure, from starvation. And now the peasant women, in addition to bringing bread for sale, were also bringing shovels. And the young men buried the dead in shallow graves. Another scene, I was standing with my mother by a fire trying to warm myself, and a young woman approached, holding a baby in her arms, wrapped in blankets, and people assumed that she wanted to warm herself and the baby, so they parted, letting her come close to the fire. But as she did so, a man looked into her arms and said, "Lady, your baby doesn't need warming anymore. The baby was dead." The man took the dead baby out of the mother's arm and proceeded where the Soviet soldiers were guarding the borders. And the crowd followed him. He laid the baby in front of one of the guards, and the crowd started shouting, "Let us in, let us in. See, we are dying one by one." And that guard didn't say a thing, just kicked the baby back into the crowd. Like all others, it was buried. Then our parents decided we are going to die there unless they don't do anything drastic. So one night, my father smuggled himself across the border. On the Soviet side, he bribed an official to give him a letter permitting the family to cross the border. But when he returned with that letter, the letter said he may take his children, said nothing about my mother. And the guards would not let my mom go. Our parents decided that our father should take my sister and myself to safety and see what he can do thereafter to bring over mom. We walked a whole night in the forest, and for me the pain was extreme. I had wounds on my feet that were wrapped with rags, and the earth was frozen and hard. But eventually we made it to the city Bialystok where my parents were headed. Around that city were clusters of Jews from Poland. We ended up in one such cluster. It was a wooded area with a lot of scattered little cabins. This must have been at one time the property of a wealthy landlord, and those cabins were for the workers. There were no furniture of any kind, a few families on the floor in a small cabin. But after being for 6 weeks outdoors in the winter, laying on a wooden floor with a roof over my head, I probably felt like a queen in a palace. Our father had no more money left, and also travel in the Soviet Union then was forbidden. Only those who were big dignitaries or had a lot of money to bribe an official would be able to get a ticket and a permission to travel. So our father tried to reach the no man's land on rooftops of trains. He was caught by the police, put in jail for a while, let out, and kept on trying it over and over. During all that time, when our father was gone, my sister and I were left alone. Here and there, some caring person brought us a meal, but I don't remember what and how we were able to eat beside that. Eventually, our father made it to the no man's land, but by the time he got there, no one was there. The Nazis came, took all the people, including my mother, put them on trains in direction to Poland and Germany. For a little girl, to think that she might never see her mama was difficult to understand how that could be, more even difficult to live with that idea. Our father found some work in the city, was commuting daily. My sister and I were left alone. She became my little mama, and we managed as well as we could. Days went by, weeks went by, maybe even more. Nothing unusual happened. Then one day, we were standing over a basin, propped up on a low stool so I could reach it, trying to do the family laundry. What did I know how you do laundry? I spilled it on myself and on the floor. My knuckles got bloody. My sister was upset. I was angry. In the midst of all that tension, the door to our cabin opened, and our mother walked in. You can imagine my enormous joy and excitement, but also my confusion. We didn't know whether she was alive. We didn't hear anything from her, and suddenly she showed up. It took me an enormous length of time to trust that my mother will not disappear just as she suddenly came. I would wake up many times at night just to touch his mama here. Well, we were happy. We were together. That was the main thing. We were together. And we were no longer hungry as we were in no man's land. But the joy did not last for very long. We started hearing that Soviet soldiers were coming in the middle of the night and taking away all the young men, and no one knew what happened to these men. And my father then was a young man. One day, there was a rumor that such a raid is scheduled for our cluster. So my mother took the train toward the city where my father worked to warn him that is not to come back until he hears from her. But she missed the last train coming back to us. And that night, when my sister and I were alone, Soviet soldiers kicked in the door of the cabins. They said, "Get your stuff." And they marched us to a train station where there was a long line of cattle cars. And they would shove in as many people as they could in each of those box cars. My sister and I cried and cried that we are not going to go without our parents. And those soldiers kept on telling us lies. When the platform was almost empty of people, we saw from a distance a small truck and our parents on it. Was I happy to see them and relieved. Never asked how they heard about the raid, how they found transportation. All it mattered, they were there. And as soon as they arrived, they shoved us in one of those box cars. So many people in each of them that there was no room to stretch yourself on the floor. People were leaning against bags, suitcases, against one another or whatever they could. There were two sliding doors that would close the boxcar, and across them on the outside, a heavy metal bar. When we were inside and the doors pulled, we were unable to open them. We had to wait until the soldiers decided to do so, and you never knew when they would. And when the doors were pulled, it was so dark inside, you could hardly see. There were no windows. The only light was that which was coming between the cracks of the boards. Once a day, soldiers walked around with buckets of soup. Everyone was given a cup of soup. On the days when we were lucky, we got with it a little piece of bread. But those lucky days were very far apart. Once, sometimes twice a day, they let everyone out under the train to relieve themselves. And you know, doesn't take very long. You forget about that notion of privacy. You just do what you have to do. People were extremely hungry, just on a cup of soup a day. Many of them were getting sick. Everyone scared, not understanding why the soldiers picked us up, where they're taking us, and what they would do with us. We were on the train somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, and delivered to a labor camp in the Siberian taiga. Taiga is a dense forest covering the northern part of Russia. Our little houses were placed right against the forest. Bears would come to the door front. At night, we heard Siberian wolves howling, and we were scared because we heard stories about wolves attacking people in the dark. And in Siberia, in wintertime, it's dark most of the time. There are only about 3 hours of daylight, and the rest is dark like night. And in the summer, it is reversed. Temperature there would drop to 50, sometimes 60 below. If a bird, for some reason, did not fly away on time, it would freeze to the tree like a lump of ice. When you were outside and did not have layers and layers over your face, breathing felt like swallowing sharp objects. We did not have clothing for that kind of a climate. And for me, a kid that size, going outside in the winter was very treacherous because the snow was much higher than I was. Everyone had to work, including my sister, who was by then 10, maybe turning 11. The main work was a cement factory, and some young men were sent to further clear the forest. Everyone had to work. Everyone had to work. The thing that went on from day to day was so scary to me, not understanding what's going on and not knowing what will come the next day, day to day. We were in Siberia 2 to 2.5 years, somewhere there between one and the other. And during all that time, I remember only one day not being hungry. Hunger was a daily part of my life. There was one store there, and whatever happened to be in the store was rationed. Everything was rationed, including bread. My mother sent me to the store to get the family's rations of bread. And bread looked like a big, round, lumpy loaf sitting on the counter or on a shelf. And the clerk in the store would weigh what is the portion, in our case, for 4 people. You know, I did not talk to my children about my Holocaust experiences. I never talked to anyone until a few years ago I started talking about it. There were people who worked with me for many years, and all they knew is that I was born in Europe. But my youngest child, Naomi, kept on asking me, and apparently I related some bits and pieces, because that story that I started telling you about going to the store to get the rations of bread, I found it in Naomi's high school writing. And I told her that I was giving a large piece. The clerk would weigh what is the portion for 4 people, and with it a tiny, tiny little piece. And I told Naomi that it took so much willpower for me to resist my desire of eating the little piece, because I was extremely hungry. So she said, if you are hungry, how come you didn't eat it? I told her this was the bread for the whole family, and we had to wait and see until Mother divides it, and then she would hand it for each of us our share. But no sooner did I hand over the bread to Mama, she took the little piece and put it in my mouth. At some other time, it was my birthday, and my mother said, let's pretend that there's no war. What kind of a present would you like for your birthday? And I told her a big loaf of bread, and that I could eat as much of it as I want to. And I see her, so tears flowing down her face, and I had no idea what did I do wrong to make my mama cry. We were extremely, extremely hungry. There was only one day. We were in Siberia 2 to 2.5 years, and there was only one day I remember not being hungry, and I remember that day very well. We were given a tiny piece of land, and we planted potatoes. And my mother said, when we harvest the potatoes, we will have one meal till you can eat as many potatoes as you want to. On the day we brought the potatoes from the field, the store had fresh herring. So my mother bought a herring, cut it into little pieces, and we baked the potatoes outdoors and ate it with herring. I don't remember how many potatoes I ate, but I remember a thought that stayed with me for a very, very long time, and that is, I thought maybe when I grow up, I'll be so lucky that I'll become rich. Not a little rich, but very rich. Then I'll be able to eat potatoes every day. For me to eat potatoes every day, I thought you have to be very rich or royalty. I'm neither one nor the other, but I do eat potatoes. I still like potatoes, but now I have to be careful not to eat too many. But no potato will ever taste as good as that one in Siberia when I was so hungry. From Siberia, they shipped us to Uzbekistan. It was then a southern republic of the Soviet Union. Now it's an independent country. I'm sure my parents felt that going south to a warm climate, life would be easier, food would be more available. But while we were extremely hungry in Siberia, we were starving in Uzbekistan. They placed us in a very poor village. My parents were not given any land to cultivate, and there was no way of finding work. My father walked from farmer to farmer, willing to do any kind of work in exchange for food. Once in a while he would get a day's work, but most of the time not. There were long stretches of time that we lived on boiled grass and leaves. My mother would go into the field, pick up anything that was growing wildly, boil it, drink it first herself to see how she reacted to it. If she was okay, she would give it to us as well. There was one stretch of time that we lived on broiled onions. Some farmer must have had a good crop of onions, and in exchange for some of my mother's clothing, she got a bag of onions. We all came down with malaria. Malaria is a devastating disease. I don't know whether they had medication for it there. People were dying daily. You saw someone, you spoke to them a few days later, they were gone. And if you recovered from malaria, as I did, you are so weakened that I, after recovering from malaria, had difficulty walking. There were some Jews from Poland in Uzbekistan. I don't know who they were and how they were able to do it, but they established orphanages for Jewish children from Poland and would recruit not just orphans, but any Jewish child from Poland. And this was simply a way of saving the children from dying of starvation. One day a man showed up in the village, talked to our parents. Next day he came with a horse and buggy. Our mother told us we'll go to a place where there will be other children and food will be more available. I think it took us a few days on the buggy to get to the village where the orphanage was housed. The orphanage was basically in one large room. From one end of the wall to the others, boards had been ripped off the floors, propped up on a stack of bricks. Girls were laying tightly one next to the other on those boards, covered with old blankets, and their heads completely shaved. You remember the pictures of my long braids? They shaved my head completely. Across the room, the same arrangement for boys, and their heads shaved as well. The caregivers shaved the children's heads because the sanitary conditions were horrible. I don't remember when and where I was able to take a bath or a shower. And they feared that under those conditions, the kids will come down with lice that spread diseases. And apparently lice nestle in hair. Well, we were about 100 bald-headed kids, and we found out very quickly that lice nestle in all kinds of other places as well, because we were all bald-headed and ended up covered with those crawling things. And your skin burns and itches so badly that you are ready to rip it off. And you know the strange things. You know how many years have passed since then. I talk about it, and my head starts itching so badly that all I want to do is just put in my 10 fingers. and scratch. It doesn't last for very long, but for a few minutes it just comes back. A few months after entering the orphanage, my father died. There was an epidemic of dysentery in the village they lived. There were no physician, no pharmacy. My mother walked a whole night to another village in search of penicillin. I don't know whether she obtained it or not, but when she returned, my father was dead, buried in a communal grave. My mother didn't even know in which one. The war ended in 1945, as you know, but I stayed in that orphanage in Uzbekistan till 1946. I don't know what was the reason we were unable to return sooner, but I had no other choice but to wait. During all the years of the Holocaust, extreme hunger to the point of almost starvation was a daily part of my life. There were years of great loneliness when I was in the orphanages without my parents. The few adults who were there, their main function was to see where they can get some food. We were kind of left to our own devices. And I tried in whatever way I could to keep myself constructively involved. I learned to read myself when I was quite young, Polish, because Polish was my childhood language. And while in the Soviet Union, I learned how to read Russian, and I would read anything I could put my hands on in one language or the other. When possible, I attended a kind of a semi-school, but my educational opportunities were extremely limited. The only place where I was expressing how I felt and what I thought is in writing poetry. I was writing poetry since I was a young girl. My home in Michigan was hit by a tornado 1975. Half of the house ripped off and blown away, and with it most of my belongings. A few years ago, I was looking for a book which I thought survived the tornado. And to my great surprise, not only did I find the book, but in that book I found a notebook of my poems from the orphanage. I had a whole stack of them, tightly written because paper was very precious. But that one survived. You can imagine how yellow it is with age. This must have been written somewhere between 44 and 46. I was afraid to pick it up, that it will crumble in my hand, but it didn't. And reading some of those poems as an adult, I am surprised that nothing there indicates it has been written by a child. Nothing cute, nothing funny, just expressing longing for normalcy, how wonderful it must be to live in a small place with my family, not 100 kids in one room. And how wonderful probably it is not to be hungry. I'm sure I didn't remember what it felt like. It was an idea. And thinking of my cousins and my aunts, to see them again, and attending a school. I was always a child who wanted to know and was asking questions, always curious, and imagined how great it would be to attend a school. And poetically describing Poland, Poland to me was the most marvelous place on earth. But of course, I left Poland, I was 5 years old. Not just that, but years had passed since I was in Poland. But when I returned to Poland with my orphanage in 1946, nothing of what I envisioned or hoped for became a reality. First of all, I spent another 4 or 5 years in orphanages after the war. Anti-Semitism was still raging in Poland after the war. Quite a lot of Jews had been killed by Polish people in small towns after the war. The tiny, tiny Jewish community that was left alive tried to do everything possible for us, the children who survived, to protect us and to provide as good condition as they were able to. The orphanage was for Jewish children, so was the school, and so were the caregivers. A tiny school, because there were just a handful of us kids left alive, and that was, I was then in a city called Krakow. That school took us once to what used to be a concentration camp. In the display room was a pile of shoes, men's shoes, women's shoes, little kid shoes, shoes of those who were sent to the gas chambers to die. There was a tall pile of hair. Women who had long hair, they cut their hair before sending them to death, and they used the hair for various purposes. There were lamps with shades made of human skin, soap made from human flesh. It took me an enormous length of time before I could take a bar of soap in my hand and not think of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I told you earlier that my extended family in Poland was close to 100 members. Not a single one of them survived. They were all killed, every one of them. For my mother to continue living in Poland, she felt like living on the graveyard of her brothers and sisters. She and my older sister, who was by then married, she married a boy from the orphanage, they decided to immigrate to Israel. This was the only place they could leave because the Israeli government was helping the Jews who wanted to come over. I did not know anything about Israel. I was so eager to stay in Poland and catch up on all those years that I was unable to attend a school. But the ruling in the orphanage was that once I reached the age of 17, I would have to leave and take care of myself. I did not know a single person in Poland, nor any other place outside of my orphanage. The orphanage was my world of people. Though I did not live with my mother and my sister, I was able periodically to take public transportation and visit with them. And apparently they provided some emotional support which I needed, because I did not have the courage to be left alone in Poland after my sister and my mother leave. So in 1950, I joined my mother to immigrate to Israel. Israel was a different chapter of my life with different challenges. I did not know anyone in Israel. I knew I would have to support myself. And I was pretty sure I would have to support my mother as well because she was a sick woman. And I did not know the language spoken in Israel, which is Hebrew. But as you can see, I survived. I don't want to leave you. Can you turn it on? I don't want to leave you with the thought that here is this poor woman who has such a tough life, because I don't think of myself that way at all. Not only am I fortunate that I survived, but I am fortunate that I survived and I was able to create a meaningful life. Let me see if this will work. Whoops. How do we
You could turn the lights on.
No, oh yes, could you please? Thank you. A little more. Yeah. This is My passport photo, this is what I looked like when I came to the United States. I was 21 years old. I was married, had a little baby, and did not know a word of English. That was the third country I was coming without knowing the spoken language. Soviet Union without Russian, Israel without Hebrew, United States without English. But fortunately, when I was young, I was picking up languages extremely fast. It didn't take me too long. I entered the University of Cincinnati. I lived in Cincinnati for about 17 years. I earned an undergraduate degree in psychology, then a master's in social psychology. A few years later, I entered Xavier University, also in Cincinnati, earned a second master's, an MBA, with a major in hospital management. I had very rewarding work, including for a year, I served on an advisory committee in Washington, D.C., a committee that dealt with women, children, and drug addiction. I am retired now, which means I work and I don't get paid. Occasionally I do, but more often not. But I do the things that are extremely important to me. My whole adult life, I tried to live by the Jewish ethical principle called in Hebrew Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam literally means repairing the world. Implied in it is that we each have a responsibility to do everything we can to make this world a little better for everyone. How I do it is, first of all, how I relate to people in my personal life, my professional life, my volunteer. I respect fully and equally every good human being. Doesn't matter what's their religion, what's the color of their skin, where they came from, what's their lifestyle. They are good human beings. I welcome them. They have my full respect. I try to use my time and my skills to enrich the life of my community. One of these days, you might come to our beautiful museum, Detroit Institute of Arts, and there I'll talk to you about art and not about the Holocaust. I am a docent, I give tours, and I teach art. Or you will find yourself in the courthouse with some legal issues, and the judge might say, you have to go to mediation first. And you might end up with me. I'm a mediator in courts. I serve on the board of directors of the oldest civil rights organization called the American Jewish Committee. But the most important thing for me, what I do is to use my Holocaust experiences to promote tolerance and acceptance of diversity. But one other thing that is extremely important to me and that I do, my whole adult life, I tried to do everything I was financially able to help organizations which work throughout the world to alleviate hunger. No child in the world should go hungry, because hunger not only depletes the body, it depletes its soul, and sometimes the soul goes before the body does. Now let me tell you about my mission in promoting tolerance and diversity. The story that I told you, which is just in the tip of the iceberg, I hope that you will read it fully in my memoir published by the University of Michigan. I will tell you about it more. But this is not just the darkest chapter of human history, but it is a chapter that can repeat itself unless we learn from it. Here was a country, a leader, talk about Hitler, talk about the Nazism, that decided that only those who are tall, blonde, and blue-eyed had the right to live, and no one else does. Before attacking the Jews, and of course he selected the Jews as the scapegoat because anti-Semitism existed in Europe already, and he knew he would get help. But before focusing and trying to kill every Jew, he killed the sick, the emotionally ill, the handicapped, and quite a lot of clergy who were in his way. And horrors like a Holocaust don't come on all at once. They start off with some policies of social injustice people willingly and unwillingly accept, and then through increments grow to become monsters difficult to control. Attacking the free press, delegitimatizing it, closing it, attacking the judicial system, delegitimatizing it, finding one group of people as a scapegoat and everything wrong in the country and attribute it to them, and only I, the leader, can take care of it, no one else does. This is what happens in totalitarian systems, the Nazis, Stalinism, and so on. And I speak, and you will have a chance, I will show you some. I speak to large gatherings of people. You are among the smallest. I have the largest was 1,800 people. I speak in schools, high schools, and churches, and military. And when I address young people, I stress to them that they are the future leaders of this nation. And it will be their responsibility to see their horrors like that don't happen again. And only will they be able to do it if they not just know what happened, but how it happened. And how important it is to recognize the seeds of destruction when they begin and not be passive bystanders. Because once you let them to progress and progress, it becomes a little too difficult to do anything about it. And as I said, what I told you is just the tip of the iceberg. I hope that each one of you will read my memoir, the book published by the University of Michigan. Bob, my significant other, is there. And he is officially my Director of Transportation and Logistics. And logistics falls under all kinds of categories. And Bob often will say, Irene practices what she preaches. I am a deeply rooted Jew, and Bob is a deeply rooted Catholic. And we survive quite well. Yes. Since the University of Michigan published my memoir, and that was in 2012, I have been invited, oh, this is the memoir, Into No Man's Land, a historical memoir. Here it is. Here is my website, but we will have some cards for those who would like to help themselves. Here is the largest gathering I spoke in Indiana. There were 1,600 students and 150 or 180 teachers. Here is in Traverse City, and when we travel distances from our home base, I usually have a large cluster of speaking engagement. So in Traverse City, we were quite a number. Oh, what I like that. When I am invited to schools, I speak to the whole school, but it's middle schools and high schools, because I feel that children younger than that, unless they're exceptional children, like we have a few here, it might be too difficult for them to understand. But when I was in Boyne City speaking in a few locations, the elementary teacher asked me, would I please speak to her fourth graders because they studied immigration. And those kids were great. Look at all those hands up. And they had very good questions. Here I have, Bob, do you remember what church is that? Okay. I have been in many, many churches. This church is in Marquette. This was a community-wide event. There were representatives of every religion in the community, but it was held in Marquette. And this one, last year we were twice in UP, and this was in Houghton or Hancock, which side of the river? Hancock. I was for a few years a keynote speaker in the courthouse on the Constitution Day here at the schools that were involved. And this is in Traverse City Department of Health and Human Services. Oh, this was the Knights of Columbus. Here I am in the evening banquet. Here they are. And that morning I had a chance to meet with all the women. There was a separation. That was a very interesting experience. We had it in April, last April. This was in Mississippi, the Stennis Space Center. And I am here with Admiral Oken, who welcomed me, listened to my whole presentation, bought my book, and presented me with a large plaque. And it was a little emotional and embarrassing experience. I think Bob told someone there that this happened to be my birthday, April 17. And after I finished speaking, the whole auditorium stood up and sang happy birthday, Irene. Okay. And here is my website. I will want to hear all your questions, but I want you to know before then, if you are a member of a church or any other large organization that would like to hear my story and learn from it, you are welcome to help yourself to some cards. My book used to be on Amazon, but it's no longer there because they're charging too much for it, much too much. So it isn't there. But since we have such a small crowd here, you are welcome to buy some books if you would like to have for friends, which I am told is an inspirational reading. So take whatever time you need to ask me questions. Yes?
When you were little, did you think you would survive?
When I was little, here we have some people who would like to hear you. So would you please repeat it, honey?
When you were little...
Speak it here.
Oh, sorry. When you were little, did you think you would survive?
Did I think that I would survive, that I was little? You know, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about dying. I was just thinking, my first thing, will I have some bread tomorrow? And I was involved in how can I spend the time, but I didn't think about dying. I didn't know that much about dying. Could you speak to this mic? Everyone wants to hear you. Honey, would you stand up so we can hear you better? Thank you.
I was wondering if you would like to come to our London church. It's out of Maybe, Michigan.
If I would like to come to your church, yes, I would. If you ask your pastor, I think you were the first one who got my card, right? You are welcome to take an extra one to give it to your pastor. And if your pastor invites me, I will come. And you will introduce me there. Okay? Thank you.
I have a question also.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if it's a question or a statement.
Any question is fine.
I don't have to. Okay, I'll stand. I really appreciate your presentation, and I found out about it just by accident, looking through the library's website. But I've talked to my children about history. It's important that we know the history, because if we don't know the history,
it will
repeat itself. Now, I've said that so many times, but I'm looking at the atmosphere.
We know it.
And it's strange because it's repeating. It just, the same techniques
that were used, the same wording. It's just, and I don't know if people are aware, if they really realize what's going on, but I just appreciate everything you've said. And I've also talked about, to children, how important it is to appreciate what you have. Because one day, you might not have everything you want to eat, but you might just have a potato. And you have to enjoy. It's just so many aspects to what you're saying that I'm so happy that I came, to kind of confirm some things that I've been talking about.
I have to answer if you think on that.
Okay.
First of all, I cannot talk politics. As a public speaker, I cannot talk politics. I can just tell people what happened in the past and let them understand. I have been asked many times by high school students, do you see any similarities? And I told them yes, and I'm very scared. So the notion of tolerance, diversity, and of consideration, and of kindness to one another, and of accepting a person for what they are and not what they look like. To judge the person by their character, by their actions, not by their lifestyle, or not where they came from. This is, to me, very essential. And I myself am an immigrant. I am proud to be an American. And through my life, if you go to my biography that you can find on my website, you will see how much I contributed to my adopted country. So this is, for me, the only way what I can do is share my experiences. And now I have to come back to what you said, telling your children how important it is for them to appreciate what they have. When I speak in schools, I have feedback from children who had read the books, who heard me stories, saying, I will never complain about anything ever again. I will never complain about this. I will never complain that. And what happens is, after people, and not just children, but while I was on Amazon, I would have the feedback. After people read the story, they are able to put their own life in perspective and appreciate of what they have. And another thing, what I stress to the students and to young people and to anyone, there will be difficult times in your life. Hardly a life goes by where there are not some great difficulties. I said to them, use me as an example to see what you can able to overcome. That you each have in you the strengths that is needed to handle whatever faces you. You never know how much strength you have until you have to tap into it. So what I can do in trying to make this world, quote, a little better, what's called in Hebrew tikkun olam, is spreading the word and encouraging people to be active participants, not just in their personal life, but in our aggregate communal life.
Can I ask?
They're recording, so they are wanting to hear.
I'm just curious if you can tell me what happened to your mother and your sister after you got separated. You came to the United States. Did they stay in Israel? Did they come here?
I will tell you. The question is what happened to my mother. I don't need that. I'm used to speak with something in my hand. What happens to my mother and my sister after we were separated? My mother and my sister lived in Israel. My mother had lived in very difficult condition in a tent for a few years. My mother died, still a young woman in her 50s. My sister died not long ago. She had many years of depression and was not a happy camper, but she was surrounded by a loving family. And once, it took me quite a lot of years before I could afford to go and visit her. But once I reached the point that I was able, I would visit her as often as possible. And Bob and I saw her last year in Israel. Yes.
How aware were your parents, when you were a young child, of course, of what was going on around them with the Nazis and society in general? And then the second part of that question is, how aware did they make you guys as children, if they did, about what was going on around?
My parents were politically very involved. When you read the book, there is a chapter, when you read the book, there is a chapter of my childhood home and about my parents. They were politically very progressive and very involved. They did not talk to us anything at all. Kind of a by osmosis, I gained things. And I was curious, and I would ask my older sister, and I would have whatever adults, but I did not. I was too young to get an understanding of what was going on. But they were very, very well aware. And also their reaction when they have in the Soviet Union was very interesting. And again, this is I describe it in the book. Yes.
You mentioned about the anti-Semitism in Poland when you were growing up. So, was there anything before the Germans came in? Was there any hatred that you experienced back then before the Germans come in?
Before the war, before the Germans came in, I was not aware of any such thing. First of all, I was a young child, but also, and my parents had friends who were Jewish and those who were not Jewish also. And I remember my mother reading, when I could recognize the print, I remember my mother reading out of a Yiddish newspaper in Polish to some friends. And I was so puzzled. So she said this was an article she wanted her non-Jewish friends to understand. So they had friends, and I did not experience as a young child any anti-Semitism. I experienced it very well when I returned to Poland when I was in the orphanage after the war.
Weren't there also a lot of Polish people that were very sympathetic to the Jewish people? And I think a lot of Polish people did help, even though some of them didn't. From what you said, I was really surprised that you said
Were there some people, Polish people? There were some, but a very, very small group.
So they were in the minority.
In a very minority. Yes.
Do you have any memories of your grandparents?
Do I have any memories of my grandparents? The women in the family were tougher than the men because both of my grandfathers were dead when I was born. I have images of both my maternal and my paternal grandmother. My paternal grandmother, I remember, as a tall woman with solid flat shoes on her ground with a peasant skirt, coming periodically to visit us from a small town or a farm and bringing some baked goods. That's the image. My maternal grandmother, I just have an image sitting on a tall stool with pearl dangling in her hand and not doing anything like that.
How's
sick were you when you had malaria?
Very sick. And not just was I very sick, I was in extreme, very high temperature. And when I recovered, the symptoms is extreme temperature, but something happens that you shiver so much that you feel that your body will crack apart. Such a vibration. And when I recovered, I was green like your shirt. Something happens chemically to the skin. I don't know if everyone, but something happened. I didn't have a mirror, but I looked at my skin and it looked scary.
How long did it last?
I don't know. I don't remember.
So your children now, they are fully aware of your story now. It just took them a while, took you a while before they still.
I never told them. They read my book. I didn't talk about it.
It was too painful.
I didn't talk about it. And when you read the book, you will understand why I started talking about it, but not why I didn't talk about it. You know, it is very often people who go through some traumas are unable to speak about it or unwilling to speak about it until some unusual event happens in life and surrounding. And we see it all kinds of other things that you hear of children who were raped and a lifetime almost goes by before they're able to talk about it. And I felt more probably comfortable putting it all in a closet in the attic and locking it with a key. But something happened in my life, and you will read about it, that made me talk about it.
Any other questions, comments? All right, well, thank you, Irene. Thank you for coming and sharing your story.
You are welcome.
And thank you for coming out tonight again. Her books are in the back as well as business cards. And so let's give Irene a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.